You are a total failure. We spent a fortune raising you. And now you come back pregnant? You are a bad investment. Get out. That was the only thing my father said to me on Christmas Eve. He didn't ask if I was happy. He didn't ask about the baby. He looked at me with pure disgust, erasing 26 years of family history in seconds. My mother didn't say a word. She just sipped her wine and looked away. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply placed his gift on the table, turned my back, and walked out of that house forever. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. 3 years later, I am 29 years old, and I am the vice principal of a high school that services the children of the city's most entitled elite. I spend my days staring down parents who think their money buys their children an exemption from reality. I don't blink. I don't raise my voice. I simply enforce the rules until they exhaust themselves. That is my job. It turns out, surviving my own family was excellent professional development. When my grandfather Elias died last month, I didn't just lose the only person who ever loved me. I inherited a war. He left me everything. The construction supply chain, the liquid assets, the real estate portfolio, totaling $8.5 million. He bypassed his son entirely. He knew exactly what he was doing. And just as he predicted, my parents, Deborah and Robert, didn't show up to the funeral to mourn. They showed up to serve me with a lawsuit. The charge was undue influence. They claimed I had manipulated a senile old man, isolating him to steal their birthright. It was a lie so bold it was almost impressive. But instead of fighting them in the press or screaming my innocence on social media, I did absolutely nothing. This is the art of playing dead. When a predator attacks, their instinct is triggered by movement. If you fight back, they bite harder. If you run, they chase. But if you do nothing, if you lay completely still, they get careless. They think you are weak. They think they have already won. They lower their guard and start to eat. That is when you strike. So, I let them paint me as a villain. I let Deborah tell her country club friends that I was a predator who preyed on the elderly. I let Robert post vague, victimized statuses online about snakes in the garden. I let them change the locks on the family home and park their cars in the driveway like they already owned it. I stayed silent. I didn't send a cease and desist. I didn't block them. I watched. Because while they were busy celebrating their premature victory, I was busy meeting with Reynolds. Reynolds isn't a lawyer you hire to mediate a dispute. He is a lawyer you hire to end one. He sat across from me in a glass-walled office, looking at the file I had compiled. He told me they were sloppy. He showed me a photo of my father driving Elias's vintage Jaguar to a casino, spending money they didn't have yet. They thought I was scared. They thought I was the same girl who walked out into the snow 3 years ago. But Reynolds smiled. And it wasn't a nice smile. He said we didn't need to win a trial. We just needed to get them into a room and let them lie on the record. To understand why I am about to ruin my parents' lives, you have to understand how my grandfather died. It wasn't the stroke that killed Elias. It was the isolation. 2 years ago, when the call came that he had collapsed at the warehouse, I drove 90 miles an hour to the hospital. I didn't care about speed limits. I only cared about the man who had taught me how to ride a bike when my own father couldn't be bothered. But when I got to the ICU, I didn't find a doctor waiting for me. I found a private security guard. My mother, Deborah, was standing behind him, checking her makeup in a compact mirror. She didn't look sad. She looked annoyed, like she was waiting for a table at a crowded restaurant. When she saw me, she snapped the compact shut and smiled that thin, tight smile I knew so well. She told me they had emergency guardianship and that I needed to leave. They banned me from his bedside. For 6 months, they held the legal power of attorney like a weapon. They didn't sit with him. They didn't hold his hand. They hired nurses to watch him wither away while they managed his affairs. I spent nights in the hospital parking lot, just looking up at his window, knowing he was dying alone. But here is the thing they didn't know. They thought they had cut off his communication with the world. They thought he was helpless. But Elias was a businessman who had survived recessions, strikes, and his own son. He knew exactly what they were. 3 days before his stroke, we were sitting on his porch. He handed me a heavy, leather-bound binder. It looked like an old photo album, but inside, there were no pictures. There were ledgers. There were passwords. There was an encrypted USB drive taped to the back cover. He told me they were waiting for him to slip, and that if he got sick, they would come for the accounts. He told me not to fight them physically, but to watch and write it all down. So, I did. While they played gatekeeper at the hospital, I opened the binder. I logged into the back end of his business accounts using the access he gave me. I couldn't stop the transactions because the guardianship blocked me from freezing the funds, but I could see them. I watched them drain the life out of his company while he drained away in a hospital bed. I saw the consulting fees. I saw the emergency maintenance charges for properties that didn't exist. I saw them buying jewelry and listing it as office supplies. I watched them steal $2 million in 6 months. People asked me how they could do that to their own father. How could they sleep at night knowing he was dying alone while they spent his money? This is the narcissist's math. To people like Deborah and Robert, human beings aren't people. They are assets. When an asset stops performing, when a father gets old, or a daughter gets pregnant, they don't feel grief. They feel cheated. They viewed Elias's death not as a tragedy, but as a payout they were owed for the inconvenience of waiting. In their minds, they weren't stealing. They were collecting back pay for the burden of pretending to love him. They thought the money was their inheritance. They didn't realize it was evidence. And now, I have 2 years of receipts, and I am done watching. The day of the deposition felt less like a legal proceeding, and more like a coronation. I stood on the courthouse steps, watching my parents arrive in a parade of stolen valor. Robert pulled up in the reserved lane, driving Elias's pristine 1960 Jaguar Mark II. He stepped out, adjusting his silk tie, looking every inch the grieving son who had just inherited an empire. Deborah followed, wearing a black designer dress and the emerald necklace Elias had bought for my grandmother. The same necklace he had promised to me on my graduation day, before they erased me. They weren't mourning. They were taking a victory lap. I adjusted the cuff of my blazer. It was off the rack, practical, and unassuming. To them, it looked like defeat. To me, it looked like camouflage. They spotted me near the metal detectors. Deborah's eyes raked over me, landing on my scuffed heels with a familiar sneer. She told me I looked tired, and asked if I was still shopping at discount outlets. I told her I lived within my means. Robert chuckled, jingling the keys to a car he didn't legally own yet, and told me to make it quick because they had a lunch reservation. They walked past me, heads high, smelling of expensive perfume and unearned confidence. They thought I was the same girl who had sat silently at the Christmas table while they tore my life apart. They didn't realize that the girl they exiled had spent 3 years learning how to govern a school full of predators. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to close the gate. Inside the deposition room, the air was sterile and cold. The videographer adjusted his camera. Reynolds sat beside me, his face a mask of boredom. He didn't look like a shark. He looked like an accountant who wanted to go home. That was his greatest trick. Robert and Deborah sat across from us, spreading their files out like they were claiming territory. Their lawyer, a slick man named Mr. Sterling who charged by the minute to tell them what they wanted to hear, opened his briefcase. He slid a single piece of paper across the mahogany table and told me his clients were feeling generous. He said they understood I was grieving and confused. And to avoid embarrassing myself, they were offering a settlement. I looked at the check. $10,000. Robert leaned back in his chair and told me to take it, pay off my credit cards, and go on a little trip. Just sign the waiver admitting I coerced Dad, he said. And they would forget this ever happened. $10,000. The price of my silence. The price of my dignity. It was an insult so precise it almost drew blood. But I didn't flush. I didn't rip the check. I looked at the number. Then I looked at Robert. I told him no. I told him I didn't want his charity. I wanted the truth. I slid the check back and said, "Let's go on the record." Deborah scoffed, rolling her eyes, and told me if I wanted to be humiliated on camera, to go ahead because they had nothing to hide. I looked at Reynolds. He gave a barely perceptible nod. They were comfortable. They were arrogant. They were exactly where we needed them. Reynolds spoke up, his voice smooth and non-threatening. He lied effortlessly, saying I was exhausted and considering withdrawing my petition. But for the court to accept them as the new executors of the estate, we needed to establish their competency. We needed to formalize their role. The trap was set. Now we just had to see if they were greedy enough to walk into it. Reynolds continued, clasping his hands on the table. He said I was willing to step down as the primary beneficiary because I didn't want the fight. I kept my head down, studying the grain of the wood on the table, playing the part of the defeated daughter. I could feel Deborah's gaze on me, predatory and triumphant. Reynolds explained that if they were to take over as executors immediately, they needed to bypass the usual probate delays by formally attesting to their competency and involvement. Robert snapped that they were family, so of course they were competent. Reynolds opened a folder and produced a single, thick document. He explained it was an affidavit of fiduciary management. It stated that for the last 24 months, the period of Elias's illness, they were not just observers, but active managers who personally approved, oversaw, and authorized all financial outflows from the company. Mr. Sterling, their lawyer, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He warned that they hadn't audited the books yet and advised against signing. Sterling was smart. He smelled the trap, but Reynolds knew exactly which lever to pull. He explained that if they waited for an audit, The estate would remain frozen for 6 to 12 months. That meant no access to the assets, and no disbursement of the executor's commission. When Deborah asked what that was, Reynolds explained that active managers are entitled to a statutory fee of roughly 5% of the estate's value, payable immediately. Based on the current valuation, that would be a cash payment of roughly $250,000. Today, the silence in the room was absolute. I saw the greed wash over Deborah's face like a physical wave. $250,000. Liquid. Immediate. Robert's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and I saw the color drain from his face. From my angle, I could just make out the notification. It was a message from a contact named Vinny. Payment due. Noon. Robert was desperate. The loan sharks weren't waiting for probate. He needed cash, and he needed it right now. He told his lawyer they didn't need an audit. Sterling tried to stop him, warning him about accepting liability. But Robert snapped that he knew his father's business better than anyone. He claimed he was the one managing the accounts while Elias was dying and that he approved every dime. He sneered at me and demanded the paper. Robert and Deborah signed the affidavit without hesitation, swearing they personally approved every transaction from the past 2 years. Reynolds confirmed the signatures and reminded them they had just testified under penalty of perjury. When Deborah tried to leave, I stopped them and opened the black binder Elias had given me, the ledger Grandpa trusted more than them. I pointed to a vendor listed every month for 2 years. Deb Rob Solutions, $15,000 at a time. Robert claimed it was for logistics. Deborah snapped that they'd already sworn to approving it. I calmly revealed the company had been formed 3 days after they gained guardianship and was registered under Tina Rossi, my mother's longtime nail technician. Instagram photos, matching addresses, and geotags destroyed any claim of coincidence. I told them they had created a shell company and siphoned $360,000 while Grandpa was dying. Robert shouted entrapment. Reynolds explained the reality. Either Robert lied in the affidavit perjury, or he just confessed to embezzlement on camera. Both were felonies. Deborah lunged for the paperwork, but Reynolds pulled it away. Robert begged me to let him fix things. I told him this was no longer civil, it was criminal. Cornered, Robert bragged that he had taken a $3 million merchant cash advance loan against the company, burning the money on gambling while Dad lay in a coma. He said the estate was ruined. Reynolds smiled. I corrected him. Robert had signed as owner and CEO, but the company no longer belonged to Elias. 5 years earlier, Grandpa had transferred everything into an irrevocable trust. I was the trustee. The assets Robert pledged weren't his. Reynolds added the final blow. Because Robert used collateral he didn't own. The loan's confession of judgment clause shifted the debt directly onto his personal assets. No court. Immediate seizure. Robert's phone exploded with alerts, accounts frozen, liens activated, foreclosures triggered. Houses, cars, retirement funds vanished in real time. I told him he hadn't bankrupted the estate. He bankrupted himself. Police entered with arrest warrants for fraud, elder abuse, and grand larceny. Robert didn't resist. He whispered my name as they cuffed him. I told him I couldn't help, I was just a vice principal now. This was for the law. That afternoon, I walked through Elias's emptied estate. The trust had protected what mattered. $8.5 million didn't erase my childhood, but it bought safety and freedom. I changed the locks, deleted Robert and Deborah's numbers, and let the silence settle. I wasn't celebrating wealth. I was reclaiming peace. Have you ever watched someone destroy themselves with their own ego? Tell me in the comments.